Hello. These two hadn't seen each other for a full 20 years, and now here they are, running together under gunfire and saving the world. Want to know how that happened? Let's tell you. But first, let's briefly go back to 1996. We're in a high school boys' locker room. A chubby guy is standing under the shower, dancing to music. His peers watch the spectacle, giggling. Meanwhile, in the school gym, the Graduate of the Year award ceremony is taking place. The local hero, Calvin Joyner, also known as the Golden Jet, is called up to receive the award. Coming onto the stage, he begins a motivational speech, but his TED Talk is interrupted by a bizarre incident. The chubby guy from the shower is thrown naked onto the field. The crowd bursts into laughter, and Calvin freezes. Feeling sorry for the poor guy, he gives him his bomber jacket to cover up. Asterisk present day, Calvin is no longer a star in the eyes of others. He works in an office, enviously watching his colleagues get promoted and brushing off stupid jokes from his open space. He married his high school sweetheart, Maggie. During a dinner with his wife, Calvin says he doesn't want to go to the upcoming class reunion. Maggie gets upset. She's been preparing for a long time and even chose a beautiful dress. Calvin then admits he's not ready to face questions about his job. Everyone had predicted he'd become, at the very least, a governor, but he's just an accountant. The next day, Calvin is scrolling through his social media feed when he notices a friend request from someone named Bob Stone. He doesn't recognize the name but accepts the request. Bob immediately suggests meeting up for a beer. Calvin asks who he is, and when he realizes it's the outcast from high school, he's speechless. Calvin immediately agrees to meet. Calvin just can't believe that the giant standing before him is the same Robbie the whole school used to bully. The two sit down for beers, chatting and having fun. After a while, Bob goes to the bar to get more drinks, and some random guy tries to take his chair. Calvin politely tells the guy that the seat is taken, but he provokes a conflict. Bob returns and quickly resolves the situation. Calvin is shocked by what he just saw. Bob suggests they ride somewhere on a motorcycle, and they end up at their old high school. While Calvin is enjoying pleasant memories, Bob seems sadder. He opens up to his new friend, admitting that he hasn't undressed in front of anyone since that night. Suddenly, their attention shifts to a trophy case dedicated to the class of '96. It looks like an altar, Calvin's achievements, a bunch of trophies, photos, and certificates, but Calvin isn't happy. Feeling down, he goes home and says goodbye to Bob. But Bob isn't ready to let his new friend go. Bob explains that he recently had a payroll account problem and could really use Calvin's professional help. They don't end up getting to it because Bob spills beer on Calvin's laptop. He asks if he can stay the night and sleeps on the couch. The next morning, Calvin comes down to hear a knock at the door. A woman on the porch introduces herself as a CIA agent. "Do you know this man?" Calvin immediately rats out Bob, but the big guy is already gone. From Officer Harris, he learns that Bob is wanted for murder and treason. Calvin begins to realize the danger and tries to distance himself from Bob. But since Bob listed him as his emergency contact, Officer Harris tells Calvin he is now bait. In the office, Calvin hears a phone ringing from within. It's Bob, who says he's in big trouble and asks to meet urgently in the stairwell. A CIA team rushes to the location, but Bob is a step ahead. Calvin demands an explanation, but Bob says nothing. He hands Calvin a gun and, for some reason, sets fire to a tie hanging from the ceiling. Calvin runs out, shouting. A fierce shootout ensues, with Bob taking down almost all his pursuers. Bob and Calvin nearly escape but are cornered by the CIA near the elevators. Bob buys time with polite conversation, then, "My time is up." Chaos erupts, and Bob seizes the moment to escape. The big guy shoots out a panoramic window and jumps down with Calvin, landing on an inflatable gorilla. In the car, Bob finally explains everything. 3 weeks ago, a criminal known as the Black Badger stole the keys to an American spy program and is now auctioning them off to the highest bidder. Calvin wants nothing to do with this. He demands to be let out, calling Bob a criminal. Bob recounts what really happened. He and his partner, Phil, almost captured the Black Badger, but Phil died in an elevator bomb explosion. Bob couldn't catch the criminal, and Phil's death was pinned on him. Calvin sympathizes but still begs to be let go. Bob tells him the bad news. Officer Harris has probably surrounded his house by now, and there's no easy way out. Their conversation is interrupted by an unexpected visitor. While Bob deals with the intruder, Calvin steals his motorcycle. He calls his wife, asking her not to go home and to meet him at their therapist's office instead. But on the way, Officer Harris intercepts him, convincing Calvin that Bob is delusional and is actually the Black Badger. Calvin starts to believe her and accepts a panic button to press when he sees Bob. Late, Calvin arrives at the couple's therapy session. Hello, what the hell? To keep Maggie safe, Calvin calms down and pretends not to know Bob. They go through a bizarre therapy session with role-playing games until Calvin loses his temper, causing a scene. His wife gets angry and leaves. Calvin almost presses the panic button, but Bob calms him down, assuring him there are no encryption keys and that he needs Calvin's help to find them. Strangely enough, Calvin believes him and takes him to a specialist in international transactions. The specialist turns out to be Trevor, the guy who humiliated Bob 20 years ago. Trevor quickly gives them the transaction number and even apologizes for his past behavior. But soon, it becomes clear it was another prank, and his character hasn't changed a bit. Asterisk laughter. Asterisk Calvin expects Bob to retaliate, but Bob freezes and leaves silently. Calvin follows, receiving a call from Harris, who demands his location and asks him to delay Bob until the patrol arrives. Outside, Bob tells Calvin he was the only one who didn't bully him, and that's why he's the only friend he trusts. Calvin can't hold it in anymore and confesses he betrayed Bob to the CIA. Harris interrogates Bob, but he doesn't break. She orders torture instruments, while Calvin devises a plan to distract the guards. Calvin gets the keys, sneaks into the interrogation room, and the duo escapes. Bob asks if Calvin still has the transaction number, which turns out to be the deal's location. They enter the coordinates into a burner phone and find out the meeting will be in Boston. The partners head to a private airstrip to find a plane. While Calvin distracts a guard, Bob preps a jet for takeoff. They finally arrive at the deal location. Calvin is suspicious because it's out in the open. He notices an underground parking entrance and suggests the deal is happening there. Bob praises him for his insight, and they split up. In the parking lot, Bob sees a group of men led by the buyer. Calvin spots Harris at the entrance and assumes she's the Black Badger. He tries to call Bob but gets no answer. Panicking, he rushes to warn him but sees Bob pointing a gun at him. Bob reveals a flash drive, and suddenly, Phil, the fake dead partner, appears, claiming he's the real Black Badger. The buyer loses patience, demanding both drives. Bob and Phil throw them on the ground as a CIA squad bursts in. A violent fight breaks out. Calvin, regaining consciousness, grabs the drives and runs. The buyer nearly catches him in a car, but Bob saves Calvin just in time. However, Calvin runs off, wanting nothing to do with Bob. At a nearby bridge, Calvin's solitude lasts only a moment. Bob appears on one side, Phil on the other, both pleading for Calvin's trust. A shootout breaks out. Phil loses his weapon, and Calvin picks it up. Out of desperation or spite, Calvin shoots Bob. Phil orders him to hand over the drive, but the gun is empty. The truth comes out. Phil reveals that Bob could never be the Black Badger, because he's too sentimental. Phil faked his own death and fooled everyone. As death looms, Calvin pulls a signature trick, distracting Phil long enough for Bob to knock him off the bridge. They forgive each other and hand over the keys to Harris, then head to the reunion. Arriving at the party by helicopter, Calvin introduces Maggie to Bob and apologizes for not appreciating the simple happiness of being with her. The trio enters the gym just as the king and queen of the prom are about to be announced. Bob panics and almost leaves, but Calvin stops him. He hacked the voting system, rigging it so Bob would win. Bob walks into the crowd to thunderous applause. On his way, he encounters Trevor, who tries to make fun of him again. But this time, Bob is no longer afraid. He knocks him out with one punch and steps onto the stage. Bob says that 20 years ago, he stood there completely defenseless, and everyone laughed at him. But now things are different. He has a best friend who taught him not to be afraid to be himself. To everyone's shock, Bob strips down, standing completely naked in front of the crowd. Months later, Bob waits outside Calvin's house as Calvin says goodbye to his pregnant wife. He's there to give Calvin a memento from the past and support him on his first day at his new job. You have stories of friendships that started years after being apart. And don't forget to like this recap and subscribe to the channel for more cool movie breakdowns.